Have you ever found a Twitter post so wrong that you wound up making a video about it about 2 years later? Well, here's my example, as I actually thought this would be a good way to explain how units take up space and maneuver on a battlefield. In this case, Alexander Vindman, who used to be a colonel in the intelligence branch, claims that the Russians have 55 battalion tactical groups in one part of Ukraine and that that's able to, quote, cover 55 kilometers. In this example, we have a division, which tends to be between 10 to 20,000 soldiers, and in Russian units tends to be about 12,000 soldiers, advancing towards an enemy that's on the right side of the screen. The division is made up of 3 brigades, and in this case, it's advancing with 2 brigades up and 1 in depth. Behind the 3rd brigade, you have the combat support elements, things like artillery and engineers, and then the sustainment elements behind that. That's the supply, maintenance, medical facilities, etc. However, the brigades don't make up the entirety of the division's area of operations. The brigades are the units within the division that can slug it out with the enemy, that is, be decisively engaged, to hold ground and to take ground. However, to locate the enemy, such as in the reconnaissance screen, or to non-decisively engage the enemy, such as on a flank guard, or to cover off gaps between the brigades to fill out the frontage of the division, there are divisional troops known as economy of force units. These are lightly armored but highly mobile armored fighting vehicles that require a minimum of crew, and so the units themselves are very low on personnel. As an example, the armored cavalry regiments of the US Army during World War II had about 1,500 soldiers. However, they were capable of covering the same amount of frontage on the defense as a US Army infantry division of about 15,000 soldiers, so 10 times as large. Now, the armored cavalry regiment can't hold ground against the enemy or take ground against the enemy. They can fight to delay the enemy, so in the offense, economy of force units focus on finding, and to a lesser extent, fixing the enemy, as well as guarding the flanks. On the defensive, these economy of force units are used to cover off areas where you don't expect the enemy to attack because of poor terrain, but you do need to allocate something in order to at least delay the enemy while you reorient your defense should they take the path through the swamp rather than the rolling plains. And as we'll see, as we go through these examples, each level going down has its own smaller and smaller economy of force units in order to be able to disperse enough to survive on a modern battlefield due to the concentrations of firepower, but also be able to quickly concentrate force in the maneuver units, which for a division would be its brigades, in order to decisively engage and destroy the enemy. Imagine someone raking away leaves from a lawn while a friend follows a couple of feet behind, clubbing mice with a shovel and dropping explosives down gopher holes. For this division in the attack, the economy of force units are conducting a reconnaissance screen over the whole division frontage, providing a flank guard and providing rear area security. And it should be noted also, this isn't to scale, as for instance the reconnaissance screen from a division is probably going to be about the same depth as the 3 brigades put together. Under Cold War Soviet doctrine, the division would have a frontage of about 20 to 30 kilometers and a depth of about 50 to 80 kilometers. And this is actually considered fairly small for a divisional area of operations by Western standards. If we zoom in on that 1st brigade, we find that the exact same structure is replicated again on a smaller scale. In this case, the frontage of the brigade is about 10 to 15 kilometers. It also has brigade-level units that have a reconnaissance screen up front, a flank guard on one side, rear area security units. It has 2 battalion tactical groups up front, a battalion in depth, that is a battalion tactical group that doesn't have as many supporting elements, and then behind that the combat support elements like the brigade-level engineers and artillery, and then to the rear, the brigade sustainment. If we zoom in again to BTG number 1, we see that there's not identical but quite a similar setup at this lower level. The battalion's reconnaissance platoon is screening the advance along the frontage of the BTG, which is about 5 kilometers. They would likely have a platoon on flank guard, a platoon on rear area security. The one difference here is that the tank company is operating between the recce screen and the 2 infantry companies, as this is how the Russians tended to have things organized at the beginning of the Ukraine war. Finally, you have the battalion tactical group's own combat support. And then in the far depth, you have the BTG's sustainment capabilities. Zooming in yet again to the company level, We're now dealing with a couple of 100 meters in terms of the frontage, but this same overall structure applies. There's no longer flank guards, rear area security, or a reconnaissance screen, but you have 2 platoons up, 1 in depth, combat support and sustainment, and then within each platoon you have 2 squads up, 1 in depth. So if we zoom out, the entire structure of the division looks like this, sort of like one of those Russian nesting dolls. This is relevant to the question of how much ground or frontage a battalion tactical group covers, because until you get down to the company level, there are economy of force assets held by the higher unit whose job is to cover the entire larger frontage. The infantry and armored units then take the information from these guard and screen units in order to assault specific identified enemy positions. This means each type of unit doesn't just have a frontage, it's much more complicated than that, as they have multiple frontages. But let's apply this within the context of the battalion tactical group. Battalion tactical groups are made by breaking up and distributing assets from a mechanized infantry or armored brigade or regiment. For our purposes, just assume that a regiment and brigade are the same thing. It's mostly tradition in terms of which term countries use. Russian mechanized infantry regiments have about 2,500 soldiers in them, and their backbone is 3 mechanized infantry battalions of about 400 soldiers. That battalion is made up of 3 mechanized infantry companies, and that is their maneuver force. That is the part that moves around the battlefield in order to directly engage with the enemy. They have a very small fire support element, in this case a sniper platoon and a mortar platoon, and then a logistics element, in this case a logistics company and a medical platoon. And you'd have the same structure for the other 2 battalions within the regiment. When forming a battalion tactical group, the regiment would give the battalions some of their assets as attachments. Typically, an armored company is added to give 1 more maneuver unit. For support, they gain a reconnaissance platoon, an engineer platoon, and an anti-tank platoon. However, for Russian battalion tactical groups, the really large additions have to do with artillery. In this case, a company of self-propelled guns, a company of rocket launchers, and an air defense artillery company. This turns the battalion of about 400 soldiers into a battalion tactical group of about 700 soldiers. Additionally, while the mechanized infantry battalion can only really accomplish its tasks with support from regiment, the battalion tactical group has everything it needs to operate independently, at least for short periods of time. If the regiment is at full strength, they could hypothetically form 3 battalion tactical groups. However, usually they're not at full strength, and the regiment would like to hold its own regimental reserve. So in practice, often you'll have 2 battalion tactical groups, and then a 3rd battalion of what's left. But zooming in on our battalion tactical group, let's take a look at how it maneuvers on the battlefield. As it advances, it will have a reconnaissance platoon that consists of 3 armored fighting vehicles. Next, there's a tank company of 10 tanks, and 2 infantry companies, each with 10 infantry fighting vehicles. In the middle, they have the engineer platoon, which is about 7 vehicles, and then another infantry company in depth. Behind that is the artillery, the remainder of the sustainment, and the headquarters. The anti-tank guided missile platoon then operates on the flanks in order to be the flank guard. And this entire organization has an area of operations that's about 5 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep when it's on the offensive. Assuming that the battalion tactical group encounters fire from an enemy position, the commander has to determine whether the position can be destroyed with a hasty attack, whether it requires a prepared deliberate attack, or whether it can be bypassed. In order to show a somewhat more concrete example, I found a video from the Canadian Army in the 1990s on a combat team commander's course, showing them conducting an attack. A combat team is approximately half the size of a battalion tactical group, but it has all the same pieces for a BTG attack, and they maneuver in roughly the same way. In this first clip, the armored reconnaissance element makes contact with the enemy and reports it back to the commander.
300, this is 6-1 at contact. Center on grid 8 and line 3, 4, 8, 4. 3 times a BMP dug in facing south, and the personnel dismounted, more to follow.
So in this case, let's assume that the position can't be bypassed, but can be taken by a hasty attack. He'll do a quick planning called a combat estimate. What he needs is a fire base, a group to assault the enemy, someone to breach the various obstacles in front of the enemy positions like minefields, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, etc., a reserve, in case something goes wrong, a cutoff force, that is, someone to prevent the enemy from withdrawing once the position's assaulted, and flank guards. He'll look over what assets he has that can conduct each task. He then looks into the number of platoons that are required, and there's ratios for this based on the size of the enemy that's being faced, and from this he gets 11 to 18 platoons required, and he has 15 available. This is what allows him to determine that he can destroy the enemy at the position with a hasty attack. So here's just an example of how the plan might sort out. The fire base, he puts 2 tank platoons and an infantry platoon, and gives them as their destination as the fire base. The assault force is 6 infantry platoons, which is 2 companies, and the engineer platoon, and their destination is an assembly area. For the reserve, he uses 2 infantry platoons, and sets up a separate reserve assembly area. The cutoff is a tank platoon and the reconnaissance platoon on the right flank, and on the left flank he puts the armored guided anti-tank missile vehicles that tow under armor. Now, the Battalion Tactical Group commander doesn't actually command platoons, he commands a series of companies, so he has to figure out, from a command and control perspective, how it is that he can make all of this work. So he detaches 1 platoon from the tank company and attaches it to the reconnaissance platoon in order to give it the firepower for its cutoff and exploitation roles. But then in order to make sure that there's enough firepower in the firebase, he takes 1 of the infantry companies that's acting as the reserve, he removes 1 platoon from that and gives it to the tank company. These are known as attachments and detachments. He'll quickly get on the radio and give out orders, which will include what are called grid references, which is a 6 to 8 digit code for where something is on a map within 110 meters, for where the reserve assembly area is, the fire base, the location of the objective, and the assembly area, as well as the assault position and the limit of exploitation, which we'll discuss later.
Going back to our Canadian example, we're going to listen to the radio orders given by the combat team commander for his attack on the dug-in enemy BMPs.
Charlie, Charlie 1, this is 2-9er. Warning order. Situation. Dug-in enemy platoon. Reinforced with BMPs and 1 T-72, located centered at grid 8, 9er 3, 4, 8, 4, facing south. Our mission, destroy. We'll execute a left flanking. Assault force call signs will be provided by Tango 3. Firebase call signs provided by Tango 3. In the area of grid 8, 9er 5, 4, 7, 4. Reinforced with call sign 7. The RV will be located at grid 8, 7, 5, 4, 5, 6. Attack position will be centered at around grid 8, 7, 9, 4, 8, 2, facing east, 6-1 acknowledge. 6-1. 2-9er, H-hour, not before 0935. Orders in 5 minutes.
A few minutes later.
Orders, situation, no change. Mission confirmed. Execution, left flanking. Assault force provided by Tango 3. India call signs 2-1 left, 2-3 right. 2-2 will remain in depth and mounted. Tango 3 provide intimate support. Breaching teams with call sign Tango 3. Supported by Echo 1-1. Reserve call sign during the advance will be India 2-2. Following the advance will be Echo 1-1. Flank security, call sign 6 will ensure western and northern flank security once we're on the objective. And 2-9er Bravo with the Zulu Labs will take care of the eastern flank. H-hour, 0936. Dismount will be on the objective. On order, the platoon commanders. Zulu Labs will fall under command of 2-9er Bravo. Consolidation will be on the objective facing north. Limit of exploitation. Reference a stream to the east of the objective area. Fire plan confirmed from H-6 to H+8. Suppression of the objective. Call sign Golf 3-1. Acknowledge, over.
So with that example, let's shift back to our Russian Battalion Tactical Group.
Here we have the vehicles, after the attachments and the detachments, with the armored company with one tank platoon detached, but an infantry platoon attached in the fire base, the anti-tank guided missile vehicles as the flank guard, an infantry company minus one platoon in the reserve. Down below we have the cutoff force starting to move into position, which is the reconnaissance platoon with the attached tank platoon. And in the assembly area we have two infantry companies with the engineer platoon. Now let's zoom in here on the objective and assembly area. At the assembly area, the vehicles will move from a march position into what's called shaking out, that is, getting into the formation that they'll assault the objective through. And in particular, if there are obstacles that need to be cleared, like anti-tank ditches, minefields, barbed wire, the engineering vehicles will be brought up into the front as they're the ones that'll do that clearing.
Going back to our Canadian example, let's watch the conduct of the assault.
It's 29er, this is a Golf 3-1, shot on objective, over. 39er, roger. Tango 39er, Golf 3-1. I'm going to move H-hour up to now. Fire is effective on the objective. Tango 39er, as soon as you're ready to push your breaching teams, go ahead. Golf 3-1, be prepared to check fire as soon as the breaches are complete, over. Tango 39er, this is a 29er, do acknowledge my last over. Tango 39er, acknowledged. Give us the figures at 30 seconds, over. 29er, roger. Golf 3-1, acknowledge, over. Golf 3-1, 29er. Tango 3-2, it's a Tango 39er, start your move now. Out. 29er, it's Tango 3 Bravo, initial BDA, 1x T-72 engaged and destroyed, remainder suppressed, out. Golf 4, ainsi de 9 contrôles à vous. Golf 4, voyez-vous. 2-9 RH maintenant, soyez prêts là, pour faire un check fire là, une fois que les brèches se complétèrent.
During an attack, when you have an obstacle, like a minefield or barbed wire or anti-tank ditches, you have to conduct what's called a breaching operation. Now, it's largely hand-waved in the Canadian video, so I thought I'd go into a bit more detail. Here's an early example of how it works in World War II. On approaching the obstacle, a small team of engineers bring what's called a Bangalore torpedo forward and blow a hole in the wire. Once this is done, the advancing infantry force has to go into this lane as quickly as they can and then spread back out again when they exit the other side. With deeper obstacles, the engineers also have to mark the lane that they've created, and for obvious reasons you always want to have at least 2 lanes per assaulting element because there's a decent chance that one of the breaches will fail. We still use Bangalore torpedoes, but there's also more modern methods, such as this one where a rocket-propelled string of C4 is flung across a minefield and then detonated. However, the most effective system is to put a large plow on a tank and have it just dig up and push to the side the top layer of soil where all the mines are. The Canadian video is notionally having the tanks conduct this plowing operation because it's the type of course where you do this attack about 8 times a day, and that's extremely hard on the vehicles. Not to mention, pretty quickly you have a training area that's quite a mess. But let's return to the Canadian video where the engineers are starting to mark out the lane.
A Tango, a 39er, it's lane 2, a plows down, 8-8, a 1, a 5, a 0, a 4-8, a 0, 0, 1. Tango 39er. A Tango 39er, it's a Tango 3-2, or correction, a lane, a 1, plows down, a grid 8-8, a 0, 4-4, a 4-8, a 2, a 5, a 9, over.
Where the attack run starts is called the assault position, and where the assaulting force stops advancing, having cleared the objective, is called the limit of exploitation. The fire base and artillery will be called in to bring fire down on the objective in order to destroy some of the enemy, more importantly, suppress them so they're not able to shoot at the assault force pushing through the objective. And once the obstacles have been cleared by the engineers, the assault force will move through lanes cleared by them, and they'll advance through the objective up to the limit of exploitation.
Now let's go back to the Canadian video, where we see the breach be completed and the assault on the enemy position begin.
A 2-9er, it's a Tango 3-9er. Lead elements breaching lane 1 will be clear in figures at 2. Over. A 2-9er. C'est 2-1, c'est 2-9, c'est beau, vous pouvez y aller. Gardez votre position de l'autre bord de la brèche. Que 2-3 arrive. Victor de 1. Tango 39, this is a generic. Please send a syrup on lane 2. Tango 39, go on 1. Both line open, over. Tango 39er, act out. Tango 39er, this is a 6-1, west and north flank is secure. Tango 39er. Correction, Tango 39er Bravo, it's a Tango 39er, send PDA on objective, over.
While this is occurring, the cutoffs will move into place so that, as the attack on the objective is complete, if any enemy attempt to withdraw out of the position, the cutoff force engages them. There's also a lot of complicated work that has to happen to make sure that the fire base and the artillery gets their fire close enough to the assault force that the enemy is effectively suppressed, but does this without ever having any friendly fire casualties on the assault force.
Back to the Canadian video, let's watch as the infantry and tanks destroy the enemy at the objective and push through to the limit of exploitation.
7-1, it's Tango 3 Bravo, check fire now out.
Commander, this is a Golf 3-1, check fire over.
2-9er. Capitaine 2-3, ici Victor 2-3, 10 boss, 10 boss, 10 boss. Collez vos chars, les gars, collez vos chars. On va votre coller sur son char, 2-3 fois, votre coller sur son char en avant. Victor 2-1, c'est 2-9, bravo, là. Sécurité du flanc gauche, le long de la route, c'est votre tâche terminée. Victor 2-1.
Avant. Faut que tu spottes les chars. 2-9, ici 2-3. Je confirme, je peux puncher mes deux tangos mon côté à vous. OK, pour ça maintenant.
Zulu 2-3, ici Victor, on se dirige sur le flanc Est maintenant. C'est engagé en profondeur.
Once the limit of exploitation has been reached, the BTG commander will call for what's called consolidation. This is where the battalion tactical group will rendezvous at a location usually fairly close to where the objective had been, set up a hasty defense while they deal with casualties, vehicle breakdowns, resupplying ammunition and fuel, before reassembling back into march formation in order to continue the advance. So in this case, the various detached units such as the tank platoon and the infantry platoon reunite with their original companies, and the advance continues.
So for our final clip from the Canadian video, let's watch them conduct the consolidation.
Correction, Tango 3-1, you have the west. 3-2, you've got the east. I'll take the center. Out. A 2-9er, this is a 2-9er Bravo. You have a Zulu perimeter on the east, southeast, and northeast. Over. Tango 3-9er, it's Tango 3 Bravo. I'm set providing a cutoff and flank security east. A 7-1 will be set in figures 5 in the west, over. 2-9, reçu. 2 reçu. 2-9er, this is 7. Flank security set, grid 887490. A max observation of 4,000, a max fire of 2,000, over. 2-9er, roger.
Beyond needing to explain why Colonel Vindman was so wrong in his tweet from over a year ago, I swear I'm not petty. I went into all this detail about how a combined arms attack functions for two reasons. Firstly, to give some context as to what might have occurred during the Ukrainian summer offensive in 2023. And second, to understand the kind of room that units take up in terms of frontage in a bit better detail. Let's start with Ukrainian summer offensive. There are about a half dozen drone-based videos of failed Ukrainian assaults on the Russian defensive line during the summer offensive. By and large, they showed a number of armored vehicles that had clearly failed a breaching operation of a minefield. Typically, it's clear that it was a breaching operation because you can see the churned up earth where the mine plows attempted to breach the minefield, often with it being clear that the later casualties were attempt to recover initially damaged vehicles. I've seen a lot of speculation at the time as to what these videos tell us. Do mine breaching operations not work? Are the Russian minefields too good? Were the Ukrainians incompetent? Have we returned to a static period of warfare like World War I, where offensives in general are pointless? The problem with these drone-based videos is that they make you feel like you're observing what's happening on the battlefield, while you're missing so much of the wider context. These failed assaults by the Ukrainians during the summer offensive would have been part of the same general combined arms template that I just went over for battalion tactical group attack. Therefore, when you see a single burning vehicle that was meant to be breaching an obstacle, you really should have dozens of questions that would involve you seeing a lot more than that burning vehicle. Was there sufficient combat power in the fire base? Was there enough artillery to suppress the Russian positions? Was there enough reconnaissance done to understand the minefield and where the Russian positions to be suppressed were? Was there sufficient air defense? Once a lane was breached, was it properly checked and marked by the engineers? Did the assaulting force passing through the lane stay within the lane barriers? Did they achieve multiple breaches for the same assaulting force? If one of the breaches fails and the other succeeds, you're not supposed to try to recover the damaged breaching vehicle. You're supposed to first complete the assault, and then when you're no longer under your enemy fire, you can recover the vehicle under a lot safer conditions. For the various videos where it appears several vehicles were destroyed trying to recover the initial damaged breaching vehicle, did this occur for no reason, or did all of the breaches fail? I hope you can also see from this video that a combined arms assault, where you conduct a breaching operation on a minefield followed by the destruction of a defensive position, is one of the most difficult and dangerous actions you can undertake in a combat zone. It requires a lot of rehearsal and very well-trained soldiers. It also requires overwhelming firepower. While conducting the breaching vehicle is slow and extremely vulnerable. Even once the breach is complete, the assault force has to move through a very narrow lane, and if the enemy is not heavily suppressed, it's extremely easy for them to destroy the lead vehicle passing through the lane and then cause complete chaos for all the vehicles behind it. From the analysis I've seen in terms of Ukrainian shell supplies, engineering assets, and just their ratio of combat power versus the Russians, my guess is that Ukraine attempted these combined armed breaching operations on what's comparably a shoestring budget. I don't think this means the end of the tank, the end of the armored vehicle, the end of the breaching operation, or the end of maneuver warfare. I think it's an illustration of how difficult these operations are, particularly when you're on something around parity in terms of combat power and artillery shell supply with your enemy at the point of attack when you should have something like a 3-to-1 advantage. But now let's apply what we've learned in terms of how a combined arms grouping assault takes place, how they maneuver, and the kind of space that they take up, with my goal being to show you how understanding this sort of minutia really allows you to have a more informed view of what's happening in the Ukraine war.
Battalion Tactical Group is a battalion that has had various additional assets attached to it, such as tanks, greater reconnaissance, and anti-tank and engineering units. And a brigade is usually able to create 2 battalion tactical groups with a reduced strength battalion in depth. As we mentioned, each of these battalion tactical groups has a frontage of about 5 kilometers and a depth of 30 kilometers. However, the frontage for the brigade is usually somewhere in the range of 12 to 20 kilometers. This is because of those higher level economy of force units. This 5-kilometer wide lane that the Battalion Tactical Group uses is what's known as their advance frontage. It's the lane along the map where they advance through. However, once they begin to go into attack formation, where you have the assembly area, the fire base, the assault position, limit of exploitation, this takes place within a subset of that advance frontage, usually of about 2 to 3 kilometers. And this is what's known as the Battalion Tactical Group's attack frontage, which which as you can see is about half the width of the advance frontage. When you have the actual assault on the objective, that's the width of the assault position and the limit of exploitation, which in this case is about 1 kilometer, and this is what's known as the assault frontage. So within our example, when we're asking what's the frontage of a unit, well, within the brigade, its frontage is 12 to 20 kilometers. The advance frontage of the battalion tactical group is about 3 to 5 kilometers. Its attack frontage, that is the area within its advance frontage where it's going to conduct an attack, is 2 to 3 kilometers. But then the actual assault frontage, that is where you have troops dismounting from vehicles and fighting their way through trench positions, is going to be about 400 to 1,200 meters. So going back to this tweet, Colonel, retired Vindman, claims that because Russia has 55 BTGs in an area, they can, quote, cover 55 kilometers of an 800-kilometer frontage. What he's doing is he's taking the assault frontage of a BTG and implying that that is the same as the advance frontage of a BTG, and even more importantly, the advance frontage of a BTG within the context of the brigade and higher level operations that involved a lot of area covered off by thin screens of these reconnaissance and anti-tank troops. Let me try and make this a little bit more practical. What we have here is a satellite image of the Anatov airport in the town of Hostomel, where a lot of the fighting took place outside Kiev in the first few days of the war. I have 2 lines here showing a 12-kilometer wide frontage for a brigade, which is about as small as you can get a brigade frontage to be. I then have 2 lanes for the advance frontage of 2 battalion tactical groups. But as you can see, there are still gaps on either side that aren't covered off by the battalion tactical groups. And this is because there are brigade assets, in this case a reconnaissance company and an anti-tank company, that cover off those gaps. Finally, we have the 2 battalion tactical groups within their advance frontage lanes. Now supposing, as this battalion tactical group approaches the airport, it's given the mission to destroy this Ukrainian infantry company that's dug in on the northern outskirts of the airport. The battalion tactical group commander decides to put the tank company and a mechanized infantry company in the fire base on the edge of the tree line and in this small village here, and then 2 infantry companies to move to an assembly area on the edge of the woods down in the south. So the area between the 2 red lines is about 4 kilometers, and that is the advance frontage of the battalion tactical group. The area in this orange bracket that makes up basically between the fire base and the assembly area, that's the attack frontage, which in this case is about 3 kilometers. Finally, in the 2 black lines, we have the line of departure and the limit of exploitation. And the width of these 2 lines of about 1 kilometer is the assault frontage. But if we were to use Colonel retired Vindman's assumption that a battalion tactical group can, quote, cover 1 kilometer of frontage, then we would say this 12-kilometer wide frontage for a brigade would require 12 BTGs to cover, when in actuality it requires 2. And this is with me using an example of a brigade that is bunched up, because it's only occupying 12 kilometers out of a possible 12 to 20 kilometers. Furthermore, I'm not accounting for various gaps between battalion tactical groups that are covered off by divisional and corps level assets. So let's look at the infuriating tweet one last time. 55 battalion tactical groups equates to about 27 brigades or 9 divisions. 9 divisions have a frontage on the offensive of about 180 to 270 kilometers, not the 55 kilometers mentioned in the tweet. Furthermore, that 800-kilometer frontage he's discussing, about half of it is along the Dnieper River in areas where it's more like a large lake than it is like a river, and in which case you can have very large stretches of dozens of kilometers just guarded by economy of force units. So how could someone as knowledgeable as a retired intelligence colonel make such an obvious mistake? Given understanding how the enemy fights and maneuvers is the job of the intelligence branch, I'll just leave it there with no comment.